the Middle East here in Iran, there's a very interesting article from The Hill titled Biden Lifts Sanctions on Two Iranian Missile Producers. Now, the title is very misleading, and of course, it's from The Hill, so it's steeped in deep state propaganda. But it says the Biden administration on Friday lifted sanctions on two Iranian entities involved in the military missile programs. The sanctions targeting the Mammoth Industrial Group and its subsidiary Mount Diesel were originally imposed by the Trump administration in September 2020 as part of efforts of the Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Tehran. And then it said that in the article that the delisting appears to have related to legal proceedings on behalf of the law firm Ferrari and Associates. I looked up the group Ferrari and Associates, and they do deal with sanctions, and it seems either trying to help their clients figure out how to do business without running afoul of U.S. sanctions, or if U.S. sanctions are they feel like an appropriate place, they'll lobby essentially for their clients to get the sanctions removed. And that seems to be what happened in this case, where they're saying that basically these companies were inappropriately listed. The entities were identified by the Treasury Department, so these are just allegations, as being key producers and suppliers of military grade dual use goods for Iran's missile program. And so this could be very vague. I mean, essentially anything to me, where you have them basically making parts that they say could be put onto missiles, although it's not clear what kind of missiles those are. I mean, it's not ridiculous for a country with 80 million people like Iran to want some form of missiles or something like that. But at the same time, you know, that would essentially mean that the U.S. is sanctioning anything that Iran could use to build missiles, and they're building missiles. Then any company in Iran that made something that could be put on a missile is now subject to U.S. sanctions, and that seems to be in part of what happened here. Now, there was a, I think, statement by the Biden administration saying that the reversal did not reflect any change and U.S. government sanctions policy towards Iran. They have nothing to do with the JCPOA or negotiation efforts. The United States will continue to counter Iran's destabilizing activities, including through implementation of our sanctions. And so this was the thing. When I first read the title of the article, got a little excited. I thought, hey, there's a chance that the Biden administration is looking to bring Iran back to the table and negotiate on the JCPOA, and to send one little signal of goodwill, they're going to relieve sanctions on two companies. This probably wasn't going to be enough to like convince the Iranians the Americans were willing to negotiate in good faith, but it was going to be, from my take, a step in the right direction. But then, of course, you get halfway through the article, and it appears that this was a result of a lobbying effort and has nothing at all to do with any change in U.S. policy. They just simply, somebody within the Mayumat company, it's one company owns a subsidiary, those are the two entities that were sanctioned, was able to hire this law firm. I don't know why that wasn't in violation of U.S. sanctions. They did apparently make some small changes, and maybe they could be in name only, to remove 3 of the 5 people on the board that the Treasury Department had labeled as problematic. And so they didn't even remove all of them. And as far as I know, they could remove them in name only and just say like, hey, we replace them, and, pay them under the table and have these people continue doing whatever else they were doing, either under a subsidiary, or I'm sure that the Iranian government really wouldn't care if its companies were engaging in some maybe fraud from the a surface level, right? Like they have different people working for them that they say in order to bypass U.S. sanctions. I'm guessing they would be all on board with that, but I could be wrong about that assumption, because it's just an assumption. Anyways, Let's just move on and talk about here for a second what the impact here is on the Iran nuclear deal then, which is almost a negative for diplomacy. Rather than at least maybe letting it be vague out there, they didn't have to say, the Biden administration didn't have to put out that there wasn't any political situation here or anything. Like, they could just remove the entities and had no comment like they do on so many other issues, say training troops in Taiwan. But the fact that they came out to specifically say that, we could sanction Iran at any time, this isn't a change in policy, is almost like a threat to Iran and actually probably discouraging Iran from returning to talks with the US. And so it seems almost a step in the wrong direction actually here. Now, there are a couple more things in this article that are just absurd, where they're talking about like dual use technology, and they use this so vague, and it's just one of these scare phrases that the US media now uses. Anything essentially could be labeled a dual use technology because, hell, a nuclear scientist needs toothpaste to brush his teeth in order to, be able to do his job well. And so for that reason, not that this has actually happened, but it seems like just the way U.S. sanctions work, it creates such a fear that, that you could be subject to U.S. sanctions, then nobody is going to sell Iran anything. And that's one of the real problems where, essentially anything could get sanctioned as being dual use because it could be used for something else. We've seen this happen quite a bit with the U.S. sanctions. Another thing that they talk about in this article is that Iran could be within a month's timeline of having enough material to make a nuclear weapon. And while that sounds like an awfully scary statement, it leaves out a whole lot of context, especially the context of the fact that the U.S. is actually sanctioning Iran from being able to export any of its nuclear material. And so one of the reasons that they have a buildup of additional nuclear material is just because the U.S. sanctions them and prevents them from being able to. But I think that, the main reason that it is that the U.S. broke the Iran nuclear deal. And look, we also should put into context there that having a whole bunch of 5% enriched nuclear uranium, that's fuel to run nuclear energy reactors. That's nowhere near what it would take to build a nuclear bomb. Iran has no nuclear material enriched to the percentage needed to build a nuclear weapon, and leaving all that context out is just absolutely irresponsible in reporting. So that's a big problem with that article. Last one here is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, and it's probably the most interesting thing I have today. Iranian general's morning jog led to kidnapping, trip to South Africa, and this is about the Israeli airman Ron Anard, and he was missing, I think, in the 1980s. Yeah, he has 1986, and they I guess were hoping that if they took this general, that general would be able to tell them something about where this airman ended up. That didn't happen, but they kidnapped him off the streets of Damascus, which is pretty crazy if you think about that. Israel has the operational ability to carry out a kidnapping of an Iranian general within Damascus. Also, maybe just how safe Damascus must feel for the Iranians, that their generals are going out for a job publicly enough that they're getting picked up by Israel. They say here, after intense interrogation, Israel figured out the general didn't know anything, so they took him to Johannesburg, South Africa, and ditched him in the street. They left him with the phone number for the Iranian embassy. So this is just, one of those crazy spy to spy things that I suppose happens, but just a story worth talking about, and to realize, what Israel will do and what kind of abilities they have to operate inside of Syria.